Hello and welcome to part 2 of our Star Trek Retrospective.
Today we'll be talking about the Star Trek Next Generation films. I am your host, David Wright, and with me co-hosting is Robert Winfree. How do you do, sir?
I mean, how does anyone do in 2020? You manage to find some sort of bleak way to struggle on. That's about all. The key for most of us, I think, is that a lot of us have been doing that for most of our adult lives, whereas a bunch of people got to 2020 and went, no, the bleakness of existence, my existential crises are coming about.
And now how we wish for those days to return.
I'm just sitting here going, sorry guys, you missed the cookies. We finished them all about 3 years ago.
I refer to Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where he talks about what to do when things seem down and you're about to die. Consider how lucky you are that life has been good to you so far. Alternatively, if life has not been good to you, which given your present circumstances seems far more likely, consider how lucky you are that it won't be troubling you for much longer.
Very true.
Last time round, we did all of the original series movies, so today we are starting with all of the Next Generation films, starting with Star Trek Generations, the first Star Trek movie I went to see in theaters. So we've finished Star Trek VI, we've had the original series crew sail off into the sunset, and in the intervening years, Star Trek The Next Generation wrapped up its run, and now they're looking to make more Star Trek movies with a newer, younger cast, and also capitalizing on the Kirk-Picard rivalry, having them both appear in the same film. So let's see how they did.
In Star Trek Generations, it opens with Captain Kirk dying rescuing Elorian refugees from an energy ribbon in space. We then skip forward to the Enterprise D rescuing a scientist named Soren from a Romulan outpost. Picard's brother, his brother's wife, and Picard's nephew die in a fire, which forces Picard to confront his age and legacy. Data gets his emotion chip and has to learn how to deal with emotions. Guinan reveals that the energy ribbon is actually called the Nexus. It's a gateway into a world where there is no time and any wish that you have comes true. Soren is using the trilithium to collapse stars, altering the Nexus course so he can return into it. He is selling his technology as a weapon to the Duras sisters in order to support his research. The next star Soren will collapse will also destroy a pre-warp civilization. The Enterprise crew defeats the Duras sisters, but the Enterprise is so badly damaged that they are forced to make a crash landing on the planet. Picard tries to stop Soren on the surface. He fails and is pulled into the Nexus. He meets Kirk, and then they join forces to go back and stop Soren. They succeed, but Kirk dies in the process.
So Robert, what did you think of Star Trek Generations?
I remember not being terribly thrilled with this movie when I first saw it, given that it came out in the very early 90s. I don't think I had the appropriate history with any of the Star Trek material to really kind of get behind what was going on. So I rewatched this yesterday, and I know this one has a bit of a dicey reputation. There's a lot of people who aren't terribly fond of it, and on the one hand, I can see why. On the other hand, when that movie finished, I came away with the following sentiment. This movie gets way too much hate.
I agree.
Way too much hate. There's certainly problems. It's overly long. It's right about 2 hours, I think.
I never remember it feeling long when I watched it.
No, there's a couple of places that drag, but that might be more a problem of the story and the editing rather than the overall length of the film. It does drag in places. I feel like this entire thing could have been improved dramatically by the removal of the Klingons and push-ups.
I think it was just like a little payoff to a plot line from the show, and they needed someone to Uber Soren over to his Nexus planet.
Soren needed a ride, and they needed something for the Enterprise crew to do. My personal thought tends to be Soren has a smaller ship that he's simply got stashed near the observatory that he escapes on. You can come up with whatever kind of techno-babble you want to about why they couldn't detect it when they scanned. No one will care. The very hardcore Trek nerds might care. Everyone else, they missed his ship when they scanned. And then to give the Enterprise something to do, since we established that this trilithium material was stolen from the Romulans, you have the Romulans show up to fight the Enterprise at the end. You can have a bit of a thing where some random Romulan commander shows up and yells at Riker about the stolen trilithium, and now here's the flagship of the Federation guarding it. This will not be tolerated. You've incited war, blah, 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 space battle, etc. I tend to think the reason they went with the Klingons was just an homage to the original series, because they're actually in the old bird of prey that was common in the original run of Star Trek movies.
Hey, designing new starships costs money.
That's true.
And the bird of prey is iconic. And I do like how in the movie they acknowledge that it is an old design and the Enterprise could whoop it at any moment, so they have to find a workaround.
Which they do.
Though it doesn't quite explain that during the Dominion War they had tons of birds of prey that were on equal footing to all modern starships, because, stuff gets upgraded over time.
Yeah, but does anyone really care about Deep Space Nine?
I do, but we'll get to that in a later podcast.
One of the bigger complaints that I saw, and I think this is a fair complaint, This movie, more than a bunch of others actually, even within the Star Trek canon, is really heavy on the techno jargon. It's a very dense movie in that respect, and it can be difficult to really invest in it if you're not already predisposed to just going, okay, the movie knows what it's talking about.
Really, all you need to know is Badman wants to blow up stars so he can go into magic space ribbon that brings him to heaven, and that's going to blow up a planet with people on it, and that's bad.
One of my personal complaints about this movie, this might sound really weird, but it's a real lack of stakes in the final battle, especially as it pertains to stopping Soren. They mentioned that one of the planets in this system that would be destroyed by the shockwave that would result from the star's destruction hosts a pre-industrial civilization of like 250 million people. That's a fine enough stake in an abstract sense, I suppose, but that's not really going to do it for most movie-going audiences. I really feel like there needed to be some other kind of component to this.
They needed a reason to stop Soren. If it was just he's going to blow up a star in an uninhabited star system and go into the Nexus, like, well, okay, go for it.
I think they went the right direction. There's this moral imperative we have to protect this pre-industrial civilization as they all, die from cholera and the Black Plague or whatever that world's equivalent is of them.
We all got to go through that.
True. I just feel like it needed another component. It felt very much like a real base intellectual argument, like the type of mental calculus you ask people to do in Philosophy 101 or what have you. That didn't quite resonate with me the way that you kind of want it to. What you could do to fix that, I'm not as sure. There's just a lot of different ways you could try to create a more personal stake in that final conflict.
Maybe have it go the trilithium weapon angle of it is he's giving this technology to the Klingons so they can destroy star systems. So they got to find Sauron and stop the technology transfer.
Yeah, the transfer is linked to his solar probe. So when the solar probe launches, the data is transferred and you get another kind of stake to go along with that. This is not a perfect movie. The positives in this movie so far, I think, outweigh the negatives. There's something genuinely gleeful in me watching this movie back and seeing not only Malcolm McDowell interact with Patrick Stewart. Look, Malcolm McDowell could read a phone book and turn it into a compelling performance. The man is awesome.
I was about to say, seeing Malcolm McDowell interact with anything is generally pretty good.
That's very true. So watching those two play together is good. The emotional core of this movie, I don't like the conclusion they draw. There's not kind of the nuance that went into something like Wrath of Khan, which deals with some similar material. If we're talking about Captain worrying about aging and what comes next and whatnot.
Yeah, I think with Wrath of Khan, it was more focused on Kirk, just he himself, trying to figure out his position in life. I'm old, I shouldn't be on the front lines anymore, but I want to be. And at the end, him realizing, yeah, I'm older, but I still got it. Whereas with Picard, I don't think it's as much about him feeling old and washed up. It's more about him thinking about his legacy or his family. When he's talking with Troy, he talks about his family history, about the Picards that were at this battle and that battle and this event and that event. And now there will be no more Picards. He will be the last one, and that's his sadness.
It's also a little bit of the road not taken, which they especially get into once we get to the Nexus. But that sequence with Picard hanging out with his family that he never got to have on Christmas, if that doesn't warm your heart just a little bit, you're more dead inside than I am. And I'm somewhere between 30 and 40% dead inside last I checked. You only get a little bit of Kirk and Picard together, which is kind of sad, especially when you consider the genuine friendship that Stewart and Shatner have.
Yeah, and they plastered that all over all of the advertising.
Yeah, there was a big bait and switch with the marketing for this movie that needs to be acknowledged.
Probably the biggest complaint I could give the film is I think it would have been a better move for them to have had Kirk and Picard together for a bit more of the film than they did.
Because when they are together, it's great. The Kirk versus Picard debate about who's the better captain or whatnot will forever be debated. That's always going to be a thing. But the contrast between the two of them is so unbelievably evident right away. And it's just played up very well. You get some good laughs out of it. When Kirk finally comes around to the idea of, okay, I'll go back and I will sacrifice what I have here because it's not real. And I will go help you save the world, stop the madman, etc., etc. I mean, the fact that one of the things that he says is, well, how could I say no to the captain of the Enterprise?
that mutual respect. Stewart and Shatner have a great screen chemistry for the time they're on film together.
It is a real shame that they didn't get to spend more of it together, because there's a lot of passion in both characters, but the contrast between the very straight-laced, commanding Patrick Stewart and the more freewheeling, cavalier William Shatner, it's the stuff that legends are made of, and sadly that's not maximized to its fullest potential. But it is very, very great. Malcolm McDowell, it's sad that his character isn't given more because the man's performance is so good.
He has a bit to work with, but yeah, he's mostly there as the villain. This is Picard's show. And Data's.
The subplot with Data getting emotions, it's played for humor, it's played for everything that Data should be in a Star Trek movie. There's a little bit of laughs, there's a little bit of emotion, and at the end you think you learned something.
I don't know if you've seen much of Brent Spiner outside of Star Trek and Data, but he has a wicked sense of humor.
That's one of the things that these movies got to show off a lot of, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, and I think it's just one of those things where I've been playing this emotionless robot for 7 years who is completely emotionless other than being depressed that he doesn't have emotions. Maybe let's try something new. Let's actually give him emotions and get to him actually dealing with the realities of that, because emotions are not easy to deal with. We spend our entire lives learning how to deal with them, and even then some people by the end of theirs still don't know how to deal with them.
For anyone who needs just another instance of Brent Spiner outside of being Data, the character he plays in Independence Day is a representation of kind of what he will do in other roles.
It's a testament to just how great of an actor he is that he was able to do what he did with Data. That is a hard role to pull off, and he did it masterfully for all of his time as the character.
Just a couple of the quick stories about this, I guess. When they cast Malcolm McDowell, his immediate response to when they cast him, he said, "All right, I'm not being an alien."
I can't blame him.
His reasoning being, I'm not getting up at 4:30 in the morning to be in makeup. No. Gonna be human. Deal with it. Just no prosthetics. He also... If you're the person who kills an iconic character, you've really got to lean into that, because that's the kind of thing that can, I hate to say make or break your career, but it will stick with you for the rest of your career depending on how it's handled. There's like 2 generations of people who would spit on the grave of Bruce Dern if they get the chance because he shot John Wayne in the back. There's a reason that Ron Howard kind of insisted that they rewrite the script for The Shootist, because originally it was his character that was going to do that in what was Wayne's final film. And if you're the guy that kills John Wayne in John Wayne's last film, you're never going to live that down. The point being, whoever gets to kill Captain Kirk, you better be willing to lean into that, because there's a bunch of people that's going to stick with them. And Malcolm McDowell, to his eternal credit, relished the chance to be the one to do it, apparently. McDowell being such a wonderful portrayer of villains to begin with. I loved the stuff between Kirk and Picard. I like that this movie gives everyone else enough stuff to do. And as far as that goes, this is a really much better movie than you remember it is, I imagine. If anyone listening to this hasn't seen this movie in a few years, go back and rewatch it. There's still problems with it, but I think you'll come away with a much better appreciation for it. The emotional story that it's telling between Picard and Kirk, both questioning their life choices, these men who have done great things by any measurement. Saved the galaxy, saved lives. At the beginning, when Kirk's meeting Sulu's daughter, he kind of looks over at Scotty and goes, "When did Sulu find time to have a family? We were saving the universe together." And Scotty's appropriate response is, well, if it's important enough to you, you make time. Contrasted with Picard at the end, who you mentioned, he brings up this long line of events. He had an ancestor that fought at the Battle of Waterloo, or Trafalgar, I forget which one. There was a Picard in the first colony on Mars. There was one, et cetera, et cetera. Now, my brother fathered a son, and I just never got around to it. And he's extremely aware of the reality of just how he actually has the line at one point to Counselor Troy, "I'm aware now that there's fewer days ahead than behind." And dealing with that reality, that point of any person's life, when it's handled right, it does kind of tug at your heartstrings in the way you want it to. And I think this one does when it commits to it.
I read an interview with Ronald Moore, who was one of the writers on the film, and he said with Generations, very much their reach exceeded their grasp.
That seems fair.
Yeah, like they wanted to deal with all these heavy issues of legacy and family and time and mortality, try and say something really big. I mean, again, you've got Kirk and Picard in the same film, but it just didn't quite stick the landing.
It's a little bit sad that the final episode of Star Trek The Next Generation That's a really great example of how you can tell an expansive story dealing with time travel and have it pay off a bunch of this stuff appropriately. And I know they didn't want to just ape that, and they couldn't get enough of the original series actors back to try and do something in that vein where you have the original crew and the Next Generation crew trying to do something essentially in concert.
That would have maybe been a bit too much. Plus, it would have been a bit odd having Scotty there, considering he already was frozen in time and came back in Relics.
That's true. A couple of things I just had to laugh at about this movie, and I mean this in a good way. You mentioned Cameron, Alan Ruck, playing the captain of the Enterprise B. Ruck's initial assessment of his character was, okay, so how early do I have to be in makeup? And the director, to kind of placate the actor, just said, no, you don't have to be made up. We're just going to say that your character comes from a wealthy family, and this is just your first step in a political move. Which is something that he looks like.
Yeah, he does kind of have that aristocratic son look to him.
Especially at that point in time. When the Enterprise B is trying to facilitate the rescue mission and everybody's kind of flying around and James Doolan just in his chair leaning to one side, I imagine if he had the parlance of a wrestling guy, he's watching that entire sequence of the young people flying around over stuff as sparks go off and the old veteran just going, nah, F that noise.
Yeah, this isn't my first rodeo.
Nah, I'm gonna lean to the side like something's going on, but all you guys can do all the flippity doos. I'm right here. I'm too old and I'm too fat for this. I'm not jumping around.
He knows where he's best used.
I liked this a lot more than I thought I would when I rewatched it. This is a movie that I think was improperly sold. It gets in its own way sometimes. And I agree that even by Star Trek standards, it's a very techno-jargon heavy entry into the canon, which can be an issue for some people. But all in all, a lot better movie than I remembered it being. So kudos. That's not something I'm going to say about something else in this franchise.
The thing I remember the most from this film is definitely the Data bits with him adapting to having emotions, tasting a drink and not liking it, but enjoying the reaction so much that he keeps drinking.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
oh, that's it. I hate this. It is revolting.
More?
Another, please.
Yeah, it was nice to see a new aspect to the character and how they even spun that into actually having a bit more of a deeper meaning where he experiences fear for the first time.
Yeah, him freezing up in fear and then the associated guilt after Geordi gets captured.
And then he just goes to Picard saying, like, deactivate me. I don't want to deal with these emotions. And Picard just says, tough cookies, welcome to having emotions. You can't turn them off. You just have to learn how to deal with them like the rest of us.
You're a Starfleet officer. Your services are still required. You will continue to perform.
Now, even having Data in charge of the emotions by the end of the film, it's not that easy to deal with those levels of emotions and that quickly, robot or not. Though I have to admit, I really found it heartwarming, the scene where he finds Spot survived.
Yeah, and he starts crying. Like, I feel happy to see Spot, but I'm crying. I think it's malfunctioning.
And then Troy's just like, no, Data, I think it's working just fine. And it's that lovely little moment that classic Trek does so well. Or him scanning for life forms. I still love the life form song.
That is so good.
I know some people hate it, but I just think it's fantastic.
Anybody that hates that bit just takes the stuff way too seriously.
And it's a nice little meta joke about the beeps and boops of the consoles, how he uses that as sort of a sting at the end of the song.
One of my favorite things about that, too, is watching everyone else react. Because it's not just Riker. Like, Riker immediately kind of turns and gives him the WTF face. But the longer he goes, the more everyone else on the bridge just kind of slowly turns and looks to watch what he's doing. And it's all behind him, so he has no idea what's going on.
They sell the moment of everyone else having to deal with an emotional Data and Data sort of figuring out who he is now that he has this added aspect to himself. It's neat and it feels very natural, and that's really commendable. On to other things. It didn't bother me initially, the underuse of Kirk. I thought it was kind of a neat idea that he would die basically on an unnamed planet for an unknown species. That sort of idea of being willing to sacrifice yourself for someone you don't even know. It's not the blaze of glory that will be written down in the history books for generations to come. It's just doing the right thing.
In that same vein, I think my favorite interaction between there's a lot of little stuff between those two characters, Kirk and Picard, that's great. But my favorite, I think, probably by a fair margin, comes right before they leave the Nexus when they're on horseback. And Kirk's finally, he's already decided that he's going to leave, but he's still kind of playing a little bit coy. And he asks, you're the captain of the Enterprise, huh? Yeah, during retirement? I'm not planning on retiring. And the advice Kirk gives him is just the best payoff to everything Kirk went through in the original series of movies. He said, good. Don't let them. Don't let them retire you. Don't let them promote you. Don't let them transfer you. Don't let them do anything that takes you off the bridge of that ship, because while you're there, you can make a difference.
And that even relates to like Kirk's last words, where he asks Picard, did we win? And he's like, yes.
Did we
Like,
make
good.
a difference?
And then he says, it was fun. Oh dear.
Shatner himself has talked about this. I forget where I saw it. It might have been in that. I don't know if it's still up on Netflix. I think it is, but I'd have to double check. But it was a documentary series that Shatner did called The Captains, where he went around and talked with all the people who had played captains in the Star Trek series. During one of those, because they do one on his version of Kirk, they do kind of bring up his end there. And your last words were, "Oh my." What was your thought process there a little bit? And the response he gives is fairly eloquent. I thought about Kirk and this person who always loved to explore. He wanted to see what was over the horizon, what was, around the next star cluster, whatever. So as the light afterlife starts coming to take him, as he finally catches a glimpse of what's in the great beyond, and oh my. For as much kind of grief as that line from him got, it was a really well thought out answer he gave for why that's what he went with.
If I could get to write one Picard story, I would like to write a Picard that followed that advice, that did everything he could to stay in the captain's chair of the Enterprise, and is maybe now having to confront the reality that he's just getting too old to do this job. You can't have the energy forever. It's kind of the grandpa needs to hang up the keys moment, like done with all respect. And it's just Picard realizing that it's time for me to move on. Yes, I love the chair. I love making a difference. I have followed Kirk's words.
Now the appropriate difference for me to make is to pass it on to the next guy.
Yeah, I have to pass it on to the next generation, and it's better to do it now when I'm still mostly in control of my faculties, rather than me being this withered old husk that is just too stubborn to get out of his own way. Of course, have him retire with dignity, with the respect and adoration of all that have served with him, and he can still move on to being like an ambassador or an admiral or a teacher or something, but just that moment of like, it's time for me to get out of the chair. It sucks, but that's life. Instead of this whole mess of what they did in the Picard series, which let's just not go there. But that would have been a nice thematic sort of send off to the character. So any final thoughts regarding Generations?
To anyone listening to this who hasn't seen the movie in a while, give it another shot. It's probably a lot better than you remember.
It has its flaws. It doesn't quite deliver on what you would expect from the premise. But as a movie, I think it's fine, and there's some good character stuff in there, some good acting, some decent action sequences. It's a fine little movie and a decent passing of the torch from the old guard to the new. Right, so with that, let's move on to Star Trek First Contact. So following the success of Generations, they decided to do another Star Trek movie, and since Generations was a bit heady, they wanted to do far-reaching, grandiose things with it. They decided, let's just do something a bit more fun and action-oriented, and ended up settling on Die Hard on the Enterprise, as Ronald Moore put it.
It's a wild mischaracterization of this movie. And I appreciate the humor, but...
In Star Trek First Contact, a Borg cube attacks Earth. Picard uses his knowledge of the Borg from when he was assimilated to destroy the Borg cube. The cube then launches a sphere that travels into the past, the Enterprise following it. They destroy the sphere, discovering that it was trying to destroy the first human warp-capable ship, called the Phoenix, that will lead humans to making first contact with an alien species after its maiden flight. On the surface, Riker, Geordi, and Troy help Zefram Cochrane, the ship's designer and pilot, prepare his ship to launch on time while he wrestles with the knowledge that he will become a major historical figure despite his view that he is not worthy of it. On the Enterprise E, Picard, Worf, and Data must stop the Borg that were able to beam aboard before the destruction of the sphere for calling from reinforcements and using the Enterprise to complete their mission. Data is captured by the Borg Queen and she tries to seduce him into joining them. Picard succeeds in stopping the Borg and the Phoenix makes its flight as scheduled, saving the future.
So the Borg have not really been featured that much in Star Trek for a bit, and certainly not in the movies, so they kind of thought the Borg would be a good thing. And apparently the studio said, hey, that time travel movie you did with the whales was like really popular, made a ton of money, so we want a time travel movie, because that's why that was successful.
Some funny stuff on the background of this movie. The time travel thing was a compromise between a studio note that wanted time travel, and the writers were like, the Borg are really awesome. People like the Borg. Let's do something there. One of the original ideas was the basic setup for this was always the same. There's the space battle to begin with. The Borg go back in time and assimilate Earth in the past. The Enterprise has to stop this. The original idea was for the Borg to attack during the Renaissance. And their whole thing was going to be, we're going to stop the Industrial Revolution from ever occurring and take over the Earth that way. Thankfully, that was not the way they went, in no small part because Patrick Stewart said, I will absolutely not be wearing tights.
Which is strange from a classically trained actor. Maybe he just figured he'd paid his dues with wearing tights.
That man wore enough tights when he was part of the Royal Shakespeare Company to last any two people their lifetimes. I don't blame him one bit.
My favorite little anecdote from Patrick Stewart is apparently a reporter once asked him if any of his Shakespearean training helped him on Star Trek, and he said, "Why, yes, it did, because you see, in Shakespearean costumes, there are no pockets, and the same with the Starfleet uniforms. So whenever I spoke, I always knew what to do with my hands."
It's fair point.
Yeah, a nice little turnabout on that one. But yeah, that idea of Renaissance Borg, that might be a decent little joke to put into an episode of Lower Decks, but probably not a good idea for First Contact, especially considering what they did with the whole First Contact part of the plot there.
They wound up going with right after World War III, a hypothetical war that has not yet happened, knock on wood.
Yeah, we've dodged that bullet so far.
I think one of the other original ideas was that Zefram Cochrane was going to die in that initial attack, and Picard would have to take his place to perform the warp drive test and to kind of get everything back on track while Riker and the crew fought the Borg on the Enterprise.
Deep Space Nine kind of already did a version of that.
Thankfully, they kind of realized, why would the only Star Trek character we have right now who's had a lot of personal contact with the Borg not be the one fighting? So they swapped Picard and Riker's roles as far as that goes. Full disclosure, I think this is my favorite Star Trek movie. It's the one I've seen the most. There's so much good about this movie. All the acting is really good. Pretty much everyone gets something to do, which is a really nice thing that they were able to kind of squeeze in here. You can't talk about this movie without talking about Patrick Stewart's acting. As far as his performance in this one, it is glorious in all the right ways. But he's supported really, really well by a lot of fun stuff. Michael Dorn as Worf gets a lot of really funny stuff. To this day, one of my favorites, and a line that kind of gets repeated whenever anyone in my family winds up realizing we're about to do something we don't want. That just kind of visible deflation and go, "What are you suggesting?" The same way he does as Patrick Stewart says, "You remember your zero-G combat training, Mr. Worf? I remember it made me sick to my stomach." What are you suggesting? That one gets a lot of miles. James Cromwell. God bless that man.
Absolutely. Especially on the heels of Babe at this point.
Yeah, he's coming off of this very kind of buttoned down, not very verbose farmer in Babe, which is another movie that one of my younger brothers used to like to watch a lot, so I've seen a fair bit.
Oh, it's a great film.
It really is. So he's coming off of Babe and decides to lean into the sort of pseudo-drunken debauchery of this historical figure. Apparently a lot of the people involved like the dichotomy of this quasi-utopian future for humanity being brought about by this very, very flawed person.
Well, that's probably more historically accurate than we'd care to admit.
I imagine it's extremely accurate if we were to look back throughout the history of humanity. But so he has a lot of fun with this, and again, thankfully. I can never watch this movie and not come away with just the really, really sad realization that Alice Krige has never played a Cenobite.
I assume you're talking about the Borg Queen.
Yes.
Who was apparently actually a studio note. Originally it was just going to be them fighting the usual faceless Borg collective voice, but the studio wanted there to be an actual villain for them to bounce off of.
Between the studio and some of the writers, when the writers were going, they realized it would be better for dramatic purposes to have something for the actors to play off of.
I realize it works good as an element of the story, but when you consider the actual idea of the Borg, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
I think the version of this that makes the most sense to me is that if anything happens to the Queen, another one is formed. This is just kind of a manifestation of the Borg collective. They don't write this really well if you're talking about how it makes the most sense, but the Queen is not someone who was assimilated and then rose to power. There's not a structure there. I tended to kind of just get the impression that for whatever reason, it helps to have a physical manifestation of the collective at times. It serves some kind of purpose.
Yeah, much like Locutus in the Next Generation series. But I always thought it would be a bit more like when Seven of Nine was introduced, where it's just the Borg are trying to work with Voyager, and Voyager's just going, look, like this whole collective mind link thing doesn't work for us. We're too individualistic. Can't we just have someone to talk to like Locutus? And the Borg were just like, okay, you drone over there. You talk for us. And that just happened to be Seven of Nine. It wasn't like there was this special position of leadership within the Borg, because by virtue of the collective itself, that would be unnecessary. Everyone is linked together. Everyone thinks together. The will of the Borg is always carried out instantaneously.
The other reason I think that the Queen might be a necessary function, kind of the same way that, and I hate to bring this up, believe me, I'm not trying to poke at anyone, but the same way that in the Matrix there always had to be a one. There was something about the way the computer science played out that the math worked out that there always had to be someone who would wind up kind of personifying free will. And I wonder if there isn't kind of the same thing where the Borg is not only so expansive, it's so large and it encompasses so much, diversity on some level, that even if it's just for some part of the broken psyche of parts of the collective, if they think that there should be a queen, if the collective doesn't eventually decide to manifest something just because a significant enough portion of it decides that there should be one, I don't know. It's
we get very deep into the weeds on this one and into how we think the collective functions, which I think is kind of what underlies all of this, but I'm not even sure the writers know. It just kind of seems to be
It's one of those things where the Borg will do whatever the plot needs them to do when it comes to their organizational structure.
Yeah, and going down the road of Borg continuity across different Star Trek projects, that is a podcast in and of itself. But I think the Borg Queen works really good in the film. But if I just sit down and think about, would the Borg really need a queen? Not so sure that actually works with how they've been set up to this point. But shut up and enjoy the movie.
Further on Alice Krige, who has a pretty good career throughout the horror genre.
Yeah, her performance is fantastic. She is downright creepy and unsettling.
I think it was part of Roger Ebert's review of this movie where he said, the Borg Queen is not sexy by any meaningful definition that I've ever heard of, but something about the performance makes me want to keep an open mind.
I wouldn't agree with Ebert on that one, but you do you, sir.
Her character and her acting is about the Cenobites. If we have any horror fans out there listening from the Hellraiser universe, they're meant to be simultaneously repulsive and attractive. Something about their manner is meant to appeal to. How do I say this?
Well, from what I understand, I haven't seen any of the Hellraiser films. I'm not a horror guy, but From what I've heard is the whole thing is at some point pain gets so extreme that it turns into pleasure, that they're sort of one and the same.
The reverse being true as well. You can have so much pleasure that it becomes painful. Yeah, bits of that.
But I don't think in the film they're feeding you so much chocolate cake you're miserable. It's more like ripping you apart with meat hooks and stuff like that.
Yes. Oh yes. I just think that the way both the costuming and Krieg's performance for this are, I think, a better example of that than especially the later Cenobites. And the less said about the later Hellraiser movies, the better.
You don't like the one that shoots CDs out of its head? Aw.
Can we not, please? I've already done this podcast.
I think I'm doing pretty good for someone who's never seen a Hellraiser movie.
Krieg's performance, I think, is just such an unbelievably great straddling of that line, because the Borg Queen is kind of gross if you just look at her, But something about her mannerisms and the physical performance as well as the vocals, it does kind of reach down into some part of your lizard brain and go, yes.
The way she portrays the Borg Queen is a bit femme fatale. There is a sensual component to the character as well as somewhat haughty and arrogant and menacing, but there's a lot of things going on in that character, and she plays it all off very well.
Again, another kind of production note. Poor Alice Krige, that costume was designed a little bit too tight, so she wound up with blisters all over her body because of it.
I think Jerry Ryan, she couldn't breathe if she turned her head in her costume, which is actually why they got rid of it in Voyager.
The contact lenses Krieg was wearing, because she has silver eyes,
right,
were so painful she could not wear them for more than 4 minutes at a stretch.
So there's a lot of impetus to do one and done with the scenes.
Make sure you get it right the first time, yeah.
And then there's the sort of the temptation of data aspect of her role as well,
which
sort
is
of plays into
really
that.
Good. I like that subplot a lot. It's not very often that a movie can get me to bite on the kind of false finishes like this one has, but when Data comes back, when Picard goes to find Data and he's got some skin on his face and he's clearly along in the process, and when Data says, "No, I'm good, I'm going to stay," intellectually, like, okay, there's another swerve coming here. But you do bite just enough on, oh, really? That might be a thing. Maybe Brent Spiner's sick of the makeup.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of you're expecting something good to happen, but you know something bad's going to happen. It's almost like if you watch Titanic when they're going at the iceberg and they're turning to avoid it. And even though you know that the ship hits the iceberg, you're just like, oh, they might make it just a little more, just a little more. And it's just kind of the opposite of it, where you know that Data is going to be the good guy in the end, but you're like, ooh, man, like, maybe he won't. But of course he does.
The score in this movie I don't think gets enough credit, especially the stuff with the Borg. That is some genuinely exceptional music work done in this movie.
It's creepy. It's very technical sounding. I do like the actual main sort of instrumental swelling First Contact theme. In all honesty, I think that if we ever actually do make First Contact with another species off planet, we should play that at the ceremony.
I like actually a lot of the brass work that went into the Borg score. It's really ominous and really creepy, so kudos to them. Apparently one of the most difficult scenes that they had to shoot for this was the spacewalk scene. I think Jonathan Frakes mentioned this, because if you're too close, then what's the point of having the expansive space scenery behind you? But if you're too far away, you literally can't determine who's who or what's going on. So the editing process for that was apparently a bit of a nightmare.
Well, they pulled it off.
They did. That scene works. Worf tying closed his spacesuit with the cable and the removed arm of that Borg drone will never not be funny to me.
I'm kind of surprised that no one's ever thought knives seem to work really good against Borg. Maybe we should switch out our phasers for knives just in case.
Knives work, but the way the Borg work when it comes to this, if they grab you, they inject you with nanites, and ta-da, you're now a Borg.
This might be the first time they show that method of assimilation.
They probably just didn't have the budget for it for any of the television show. The representation of the assimilation process is the right kind of horrifying.
It's body horror done right. It's unsettling, but they know where the line is, unlike some other shows. Picard. You see the drill going down, and just before it hits the eye,
just as it starts to make contact and the membrane is stretching a little bit,
we cut to something else and you're just like, ugh. Just that feeling going all down your spine.
They changed the makeup for a lot of the Borg in this. I haven't seen enough of The Next Generation recently to be able to pick up on the fine details, so I'm taking some people's word for this.
They've reused all the props and sets from First Contact for the Borg after this point. I think it wasn't until Picard that they actually gave the Borg a bit of a makeover, which I personally actually quite liked. I thought the Picard take on how the Borg look is actually pretty good.
Well, I think in the original Next Generation show, to make the makeup process easier, a lot of this technological stuff looks more like it is external, planted on the body, whereas with this, they deliberately made it look like it's injected into you and then coming out through your skin, which is a much more complicated process for people doing makeup.
Definitely, the added budget for the Borg really was good for this.
Yeah, they are terrifying. Another thing about the production of this was directed by Jonathan Frakes. This is his first feature film debut. He directed several episodes of the television show, of course. But he was not the first choice. In fact, I believe he was third. The original choices were between Ridley Scott and John McTiernan.
Curious to see what Ridley Scott would do with a Star Trek movie.
Ridley Scott in the 90s, because remember, this came out in 96, and that was when Ridley Scott was still making fairly good movies. A couple of years later, he would do Gladiator. He was still fairly near kind of the zenith of his career. Now it's real hit and miss. You might get something interesting. You might get something that's overly thought out and ambitious, but deeply flawed, like Blade Runner or Alien Covenant. You might get something that isn't what people want, but is pretty good, taken on its own terms, like Prometheus, which I still defend. Or you might get absolute garbage. Gods and Kings or The Counselor. Terrible movie. Just terrible. But Ridley Scott in the 90s with this, I'd have been interested. McTiernan, kind of similar, actually. McTiernan's had also been a little bit hit and miss throughout his career, but at this point in time, I'd have been interested to see. Now, Frakes studied a lot of Scott's films to make this and the influence shows. That first battle between the Enterprise crew and the Borg and the revelation about the Borg being on the ship, all very clearly drawing inspiration from Alien.
I think we can all be very glad that he directed this before Thunderbirds.
Yes. Very, very true.
I love Thunderbirds, coming from an English background.
I know he's dead, so there's only so many bad things you can say about him, but Bill Paxton, what were you thinking, man?
Oh, I know exactly what he was thinking. He's like, Thunderbird's sweet. I love that show.
Hey,
Same with Ben Kingsley.
Ben Kingsley, I imagine, was a nostalgia play. With Bill Paxton, I imagine it was a bit more, did the check clear?
Ben Kingsley, I would have to admit, is perfect casting to play the Hood. It's just unfortunate that the character that they gave him was just horrible. That was a huge misfire and a massive missed opportunity.
So the direction, it kind of wears its homages on its sleeve, but in a really good way. The Moby Dick stuff, I liked. They almost didn't want to include it because they had already done the Moby Dick stuff with Khan and Wrath of Khan. But it's enough different in that Khan was clearly Ahab. Here you have the captain having to struggle with me being in the Ahab role. So I think it was enough different in that respect to make it work.
With the benefit of a long degree of hindsight between this movie when I first saw it and now, I have heard the criticism that it doesn't quite make sense for Picard because he's met up with the Borg after being Locutus enough times where it seems like he's got a pretty good handle on it now. It seems kind of strange that he would go all Ahab at this point after the events in the original Next Generation series. And it becomes really awkward when you get into Picard and him just freaking out about the Borg. They can't be changed! And then 5 minutes later, after they've helped him not fall over a rail, he's like, I never knew you could do this on this scale.
Jerry Ryan over there, like, am I a joke to you?
Poor Jerry Ryan. She did the best she could.
She really did.
The actual scene itself and the way that they sell it, of course, Patrick Stewart is just the man when it comes to performances like that. The, I will make them pay line is just perfectly delivered.
Oh, it's so good. I still get chills listening to that. And again, I've seen this movie more than any other Star Trek movie by a mile.
And the bit afterwards where Lily makes the Moby Dick reference and then Picard starts quoting from the actual book.
The actual quote.
He mounted himself upon the whale. Had his chest been a cannon, his Shirley would have shot his heart upon it. And then she just goes, actually, I never read it.
Moby Dick is a dense read, man. It is a dense book. And I'm a guy who likes reading Heart of Darkness. That Moby Dick is dense.
It's a good beat for the character. It's sold really well. It gives Picard a good arc. And I even like how Lily even sort of throws in his face, you act like you're so much better than the humans of now and you've evolved so far beyond our pettiness. And yet here you are stubbornly refusing to save the lives of your crew because you have a personal vendetta against the Borg. That was an issue that many of the writers faced with working with Gene Roddenberry when he was still alive, is his insistence on there being no sort of interpersonal conflicts at all in the series.
That was such a pain.
Stuff. Now we've got the exact opposite where it's all like the cheapest, junkiest interpersonal conflict in Star Trek now.
Yeah, Roddenberry's kind of view on what humanity would become in the face of this, especially when it came to the Next Generation, which was, I can't remember the exact way it was phrased. Someone who kind of speculated about the difference between the original series and the Next Generation being the difference between a really nice kind of way society had gone versus his version of heaven.
In the years between the two shows, Gene Roddenberry became quite famous for that view of the future. He was invited to universities to give talks. He hadn't intended that when he made the original series. It was just a byproduct of it, whereas when he started to make TNG, he was now the great bird of the galaxy, this sort of prophet of more humanistic, superior time, and that kind of interfered with a lot of the stories where the solution is just Picard gives a big speech about how much superior humanity is compared to the humanity of now. And it's actually kind of funny that the first episode of The Borg was kind of the writers calling him on that, where you sort of had the beginning of the episode, Q's talking to Picard, and Picard's like, we don't need your help for anything. Like, we're perfect. We can solve any problem. We're like the best that can ever be. And Q's like, all right, let's try that. Snap of his fingers. They face the Borg. Nothing they do can stop them. And the end of it is just Picard saying like, Q, you're right. We're in over our heads. We need your help. You've destroyed our pride.
Yeah.
Great episode.
The relationship between Q and Picard has always been a fun one to kind of observe. I think the last thing to kind of mention here, it's kind of fun to go back and rewatch some of these movies and find people who wind up appearing in later Star Trek projects.
Oh, the Voyager cameos are great.
One of the helmsmen on the Enterprise B in Generations actually becomes Tuvok in Voyager.
Yeah, and actually they did an episode of Voyager where that actually is Tuvok. They actually had, I think, pretty much the whole cast from that part of the movie there. They even like redid that scene from Star Trek 6, just from like Tuvok's perspective. It was quite well done, and it puts a bit of a smile on my face. Unfortunately, the actual episode itself, they never really made good use of that. It was just, hey, Tuvok used to be on the Excelsior. Special guest star George Takei.
In First Contact, if you're sharp-eyed, you can see the actor who would wind up playing Neelix on Voyager.
Ethan Phillips, he's the maitre d'
Maybe,
or the receptionist at the club in the holodeck program.
yeah, who gets kind of scanned by the Borg and curls all fuzzy looking. The other cameo that made me laugh this time around, I don't know why I'd never noticed it before, but if you've ever seen That 70s Show, the neighbor Bob actually plays the mob boss in that holodeck sequence that I got a serious chuckle out of that this time around. I don't know why, but I did.
Yeah, Red Foreman used to be the president of the Federation, so
That's true.
yeah. And of course, you like Robert Picardo as the EMH. Robert Picardo's just fantastic actor, and I think he had one of the best characters in Star Trek.
When you look at the Doctor from Voyager, I tend to agree with you.
And also, Dwight Schultz shows up reprising his role as Reginald Barclay for a bit. Took me years to figure that one out.
He's there for just a little bit and insists on shaking the hand of James Cromwell.
It was well done. It felt like a natural use of the character, and it's kind of nice to show him still being on the ship, and then it ties into Zefram Cochrane's character issues.
His little arc that he gets. I love him running away like, I don't want to be a statue.
That was a really nice way of looking at it, is just having this great historical figure who doesn't view themselves as this great historical figure, who only sees their flaws and is just terrified at that prospect of being viewed that way in the future.
Yeah, Cromwell does a good job. I don't really have a bad thing to say about this movie.
Yeah, I even like how in the premiere episode of Enterprise, they even have him giving the speech that Riker tells him about when they're in the ship. It's just a nice little nod to continuity, because people do change over time.
Star Trek Enterprise actually has another bit of continuity associated with this movie.
The Borg episode?
The Borg episode, yeah, where they find the debris from the sphere that the Enterprise blows up in the beginning.
I have not watched that episode yet. I will get to it. It's just the problem is I want to watch the episodes in between where I'm at now and then. And early Enterprise is very much a slog.
Yes, it is. With regard to First Contact, this is my favorite one. The tension is great. The action is great. The messaging, because Star Trek always has to have a message, is really good. You have great performances. You have the more dramatic one from Picard, and Alfred Woodard holds her own there. You have the more comedic ones from Cromwell and Jonathan Frakes, whose comedic timing is very good. You get an interesting bit with Data. This is one that is not like a really good episode of the show. This is something that could only be done, I think, in this format.
The budget is certainly needed to do this right.
And in that respect, it's a really, really good movie. This is, whenever people talk about the best Star Trek movies, it tends to come down to this and Wrath of Khan. At that point, it's largely a matter of personal preference. From a craft standpoint, there's not much wrong with either of them.
It's a very, very solidly made movie. If we must do the comparison, I'd say Wrath of Khan kind of has a lot more moving parts and goes a bit deeper in places, but First Contact is still very, very solid film. It's got some decent themes to it, great performances, really good action scenes. It's all there. About only the few nitpicks I can think of is I do find it a bit funny that Data can now turn off his emotion chip. We got a nice little joke from Picard about that, but it just kind of seems like after the last film where you have Picard explain to Data that no, you can't turn off your emotions, you have to learn how to deal with them, and now Data can just turn them off.
I think that was more of a technical issue in the first movie, because they mentioned at one point that his motion chip had wound up fused into his positronic matrix. So I tend to think that by the time we get to this point, they've repaired whatever damage there was, and he can turn them off if he so chooses.
I get it, and yes, practically it is good to not have emotions when you're in the situation Data is in, and it does get reactivated by the Borg Queen later on. It's just the theme of Data has always wanted to be more and more human, and emotions was always that one thing out of his reach, and now that he gets them, it's like, okay, well, I can just turn them on and off whenever it suits me. It seems like you're backpedaling a little bit on the character development. As Ronald Moore has said, they were trying to make a fun action romp this time round, and it just worked out that it turned out to be just a great film. One thing I do have to talk a bit about as a ship fan is I love the Enterprise E. I know
the Enterprise E is the best.
But yeah, like to all you people that don't like the Enterprise E, I respectfully disagree. I think they nailed it with this ship. Funny enough, like the first time I saw it was like on a cereal box. It was like on a box of Cheerios in the supermarket because, toy inside. And I'm like, ooh, there's a new Enterprise. Because they had destroyed the Enterprise in Generations because the model that they were using for filming was from the TV show and it just didn't have the detail needed for filming, so they had to go and come up with a new Enterprise. The Sovereign class Enterprise E, just fantastic. I love that it doesn't have the neck anymore. Way too easy to shoot that thing off with torpedoes. I like how the hull kind of looks like the hull of a yacht in the secondary hull section of it. The nacelles are all sleek. It looks more like a hot rod than the J.J. Abrams Enterprise, in which he told them make it look like a hot rod. Like just, it's sleek, it's tough. It doesn't look mean or evil, but it's a beautiful machine.
It really is. And I also like the joke became from the original Star Trek movies. Well, we blew up the Enterprise in search for Spock, so now we have to blow it up every time. And here they did in Generations, for as much practical, when I say practical, I mean, related to the business of the movie making as anything else.
They did do it in a pretty good set piece.
Oh, yeah. The effects don't hold up necessarily throughout all of these movies that we're going to talk about. That's a big thing. This one more than a lot because they don't lean as heavily on the CGI.
Yeah, this was still early days switching over to CGI, I think.
Preview for Insurrection and Nemesis. You get some stuff there that nowadays looks like it came off a PS2.
Even I can agree with that.
That scene when, they detach the front from the Enterprise and then it crashes down onto Valerian 3, that's a really good set piece. Here, yeah, the Enterprise E is easily the best Enterprise, and y'all can bite me.
It's tough, it's slick. I like that it's not bigger than the D. About the only real complaint I can give its design is I'm not a big fan of the bridge layout.
That's fair.
It's mostly just the two stations in front of the captain. They're kind of way too close together, so if you're actually sitting in the captain's chair, you're looking at the back heads of the crew in front of you, and that seems a bit strange to me.
I like that they play around with blowing it up and then don't, and then they play around with it getting destroyed in Insurrection and then don't, and then they try to blow it up in Nemesis and then don't. The gag about, we have to blow up the Enterprise every time now, they actually play on that in some very believable ways, and I appreciate there's some humor to that when you're deep enough into the Star Trek lore. They're like, gotta blow up the Enterprise. Well, we activate the self-destruct sequence. And then Data, nope, not blowing up the Enterprise. I like that they play around with that. There's always a bit of a kind of a line you have to walk when you make movies about established IPs. How easy are they to access for people who are not fans of the IP? It can be a tough line to walk. It really can. And I think this movie does an excellent job of walking that line. They give us enough background on Picard for us to follow his hatred of the Borg. And everything else that goes on plays well enough with the more established fan base. I suppose the last thing I'd like to mention, I don't know if it had been established that Vulcans were who had made first contact with humans or not.
I don't think so, because I didn't know, and I was just trying to think of
no,
when
that
was
was the
theater.
big that was a big thing for my mom's a big Trekkie. When we got to the end of this movie and we get to see them make first contact, there was a thing like, okay, who is it? Which alien race are the ones that showed up first? And then they come out with the eyebrows, and then one takes the hood off, and it's the Vulcans.
I was able to call it.
You have to remove the Klingons and the Cardassians because they would have just squashed us.
Yeah, Vulcans, that makes sense. We seem to be good friends with them. So any more thoughts on First Contact?
Really, really good movie. Easy to access for anyone who's not a fan of the franchise. My personal favorite. Let's move on to the best season finale and season premiere that the show could never afford.
After the success of First Contact, both critically and financially, they of course greenlit another Star Trek movie, and this time Michael Piller was put in charge. Piller is the guy that saved Star Trek The Next Generation. If you haven't seen the documentary Chaos on the Bridge, speaking of William Shatner documentaries, it's absolutely fantastic and hopefully still on Netflix. It sort of goes into the tumultuous beginnings of Next Generation and how the first two seasons were not that great, and Michael Piller was the guy to come in and fix that and get the writers' room organized and establish much of what later became Star Trek as we know it. He came up with the idea of an ensemble cast and having different stories for different characters. His contribution to Star Trek during that golden era cannot be understated, and in fact I'm pretty sure with Discovery, Michael Burnham is half named after him. Michael Piller and Rick Berman. Smush the two names together and there you go.
In Star Trek Insurrection, the Enterprise is sent to assist with a covert observation of a pre-warp civilization called the Baku in assistance to a race called the Sona. They discover that the Baku are actually a warp-capable civilization that came to the planet but stayed when they discovered the radiation produced by the planet's rings stops aging and regenerates their bodies. They abandoned their advanced technology to live a peaceful back-to-nature life. The Sona are plotting to absorb the radiation from the rings, rendering the planet inhospitable. The Starfleet Admiral working with the Sona is trying to relocate the Baku to another planet against their will. The Enterprise crew defies orders and goes to the planet to stop the evacuation, while Riker takes the Enterprise to inform Starfleet what is really happening. It is revealed that the Sona and the Baku are the same race. The Sona were a group of young Baku that wanted to return to space. They were exiled by the Baku and now want to take the radiation to save themselves from aging to death and get revenge on the Baku. Picard is able to stop the Sona's plan, the Federation halts the relocation operation, and the remaining Sona return to the planet to live out their remaining days reconnecting with their families.
So despite Pillar getting the reins to Insurrection, it's actually turned out to be the most blah of the Next Generation movies, I'd say. As Robert joked about before, is it's basically a two-parter TV show episode just with a bigger budget. And by that standard, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's decent. I can't really say anything too horrible about the film, but I also can't really say much that great about the film either. Okay things are the hardest things to review because there's nothing to get worked up about. It's great to rant and rave about how terrible something is, and it's great to gush about how good something is, but something that's just all right, it's like, it's okay.
Yeah.
And what with the bell curve being the bell curve, most things are okay. And Insurrection is fine. It's nice to see the Enterprise E out again. All the performances I thought were decently done. About the biggest complaint I can give about it from a continuity standpoint is this is the only time the Next Generation cast has been against a forced relocation. Every other time they've had to deal with this situation, they've always been like, no, you need to get off this planet.
There's certainly arguments you can make about all that in specific instances as far as the show went versus the circumstance they have here. But yeah, it's a bit of a hiccup when you think about it.
The previous two examples I can think of off the top of my head. One was there was a human colony that the Federation didn't know about that was on a world covered by a treaty with another alien race that was going there to colonize the planet, and they would just sterilize any sentient life on it anyway. But the inhabitants, their leader was just, no, we are strong. We have built this colony from nothing. We will fight them if we have to. And the end Data just blows up the central monument of their town with a phaser and says, this is a phaser. They have orbital weapons. They will wipe you off this planet. You will not even see their faces. You can build another colony. We'll help you set up. And then the other instance was when a Federation colony of Native Americans that were citizens of the Federation, but due to treaty negotiations with the Cardassians, the planet was being transferred over to Cardassian control. But this was their spiritual homeland that they had been searching for hundreds of years. There was no way they were going to move. And in the end, Picard just realized, like, well, you could just renounce your Federation citizenship and become Cardassian citizens. And the Cardassians say they don't mind you being here. So if you want to roll them dice, we're okay with that. And that's what happens. And as far as we know, it worked out.
As far as we know.
But in this situation, the planet is not a Federation planet. I believe it is in Federation space.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about the Baku and about because they don't present any sort of technology. And when they get there, then Picard's kind of inadvertently questioning them. And they say, no, we used to have warp drive. We just found the place we want to be. And we have renounced technology because it only leads to problems. And that does provide the Admiral with the legal loophole he needs, though.
But I think that this is a planet within Federation space, but
Yes.
It is not a member planet of the Federation. They don't have any representation in the Federation Council.
Well, they don't interfere with pre-warp societies. So this group, as far as everyone knows, they've been on this planet for 300 some odd years.
By moving them to a new planet, that is very much interfering with their culture. Like for you, the listener, assuming you have listened this far and don't know that much about Star Trek, in which case I'm not sure why you're listening, but thanks anyway. The Federation, Starfleet has this law called the Prime Directive, which says that they will not interfere with any other civilizations. And it's kind of hard. It depends which episode you're watching exactly how this works. But for our purposes in this film, and what I think works best is the idea is like if a civilization is pre-warp, they have not developed the technology to travel faster than light, the Federation does not mess with them. We leave them alone.
It would unduly influence the development of this culture.
Sort of like when the Europeans came to North America or Africa or Asia, the horrors of empire, even if some of the motivations for empire were wanting to spread the prosperity of the more powerful nation, they would still lead to bad consequences no matter how good the intentions, and it's just best to leave other cultures alone to develop on their own until they get to a point where we have to deal with them, and then we go from there. It's a neat idea. It's used to create some good moral problems in various episodes. Here the idea is the Baku, as far as the Federation knows, on this planet are a pre-warp civilization. They cannot make contact with them, but they need to get them off the planet because the radiation of the rings has incredible medical properties, including like reversing serious medical conditions. Geordi gets a sight back.
I shouldn't even say back. I think Geordi was born blind.
His eyes regenerate into fully functional working eyes. He doesn't need cybernetics or prosthetics to see anymore. It's that level of medical advancement, which is a huge thing to have, except to get this radiation to harvest it, it would render the planet inhospitable, and they don't want to kill the locals, so the next best thing, move them to another planet. again, that's violating the Prime Directive.
The legality of what they get into here, and this is kind of the loophole that the Admiral's able to use. Not only are these people a post-warp civilization, they choose not to use it, but they have the ability. And they're not native to the planet, which is kind of the big thing that you could hang the legal argument on.
Possibly, but then again, could we use that argument for like Native Americans saying they migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge? Where do you draw the line? I'm not saying we have to talk about that topic.
No, I get you. I tend to think that if we've gotten to the point where you're leaving the planet and recolonizing it, especially if you're only dealing with small colonies, there were only like 600 people.
But again, like Picard says to the Admiral, like how many people before
sure,
it does become?
Yeah, he correctly points out the moral or ethical thing you have to deal with if that's going to be your bit of logic. Okay, so at what point is it? At what point does it become too much of a problem?
Is 600 okay? How about 700? How about 800? How about 1,000? 1,000,000? The Federation is probably like hundreds of trillions of beings in it. At what point is the number of people you have to forcefully locate too many, and all of a sudden we're now doing something morally wrong? Picard just takes it back to the base principles. This is their home. They were here first. They've been here for, you could argue, generations, though again, because of this radiation, they're basically immortal. What right do we have to interfere with them just because it has a great benefit to us? There's an argument to be made on the other side. Why should they get to have all the immortality?
Especially when the natural selection process or what have you didn't create them. They found this place.
And yeah, there's some good ideas to be bounced around.
To the movie's credit, it does kind of present both. It certainly takes a stance in that, we root for Picard. But the Admiral's point is not unfair.
And that's always the best villains in Star Trek are the ones that they're not so much villains as antagonists. They're going against what the hero wants, but they have good reasons for doing so from their perspective. With the exception of Ruafa, who's the actual villain.
Oh, no, yeah. I mean,
he just wants revenge.
Yeah, the Sona are just the angry, hate-filled vengeance seekers.
I mean, they are dying because of what they've done. So I'll give them that there is an element of like, we need to do this so that we don't die. But there's also the aspect of just revenge.
Yeah, I'm happy to kill all of them because they exiled us from paradise.
And to be fair, I actually kind of find the Baku to be the biggest dicks of the bunch.
There is that argument to be made.
This sort of leads back to my least favorite episode of Deep Space Nine. They come across this crashed Federation ship where they've built an agrarian society, and the matriarch of the society is very anti-technology, quote unquote. We need to get back to nature. Whenever you make a machine to do the work of a person, you devalue that person, and we need community and blah, 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 all that stuff. And I just can't help but go like, that's a mighty fine mill you have over there. That's some pretty decent technology. We will use human ingenuity to solve all our problems. Like, we've done that before. It's called technology. We're going to go and we're going to scavenge for herbs and roots to use to cure diseases. Like, yes, it's called medicine.
The Luddite argument and where you draw that particular line is always kind of an interesting one.
Yes, you could think of technology, quote unquote, as warp drives, transporters, sonic showers, the modern futuristic conveniences that the Federation has, but you're still using technology. Anything you're doing, if you just take a stick and use it to lever something, congratulations, you're using a machine. That is technology. It's very, very low level, simple machines, but it is still technology.
This is one of the original Luddite movement. Nowadays, when we think of it, we tend to think of it as it pertains to the use of electricity. But the original Luddite movement was about destroying things that came about just due to the Industrial Revolution. Pre-electricity. They just didn't like mills or looms, any of those mechanical advantages. They no, we're worried about the prosperity of humanity if we start overly mechanizing these processes.
Yeah, and you can have a good conversation about that. That's an interesting issue to tackle. But the Baku are framed so much as we've got this figured out. And when the Sona say, we want to go out into space, we've never done that before. This sounds cool. They're like, no, you can't. They kind of could have just said, okay, go off. We think this is a bad idea, but it's your life. We respect that.
Yeah, if their attempt at takeover was violent, I might feel differently about it, but we don't actually get any of that backstory apart from at one point of an exposition dump.
For all we know, the Sona could have just built a starship and were about to take off, and then the villagers said, no, you can't have this, and they started smashing it apart.
That needed to be clearer. If they were exiled for just putting forth the idea of, hey, maybe we should, space. That's a thing. Or if their response was, you know what, we disagree with how you guys are doing things, and here's a much better idea. And we don't only want to go into space, but you guys know how to make this kind of stuff, so we're going to now force you. And if we get into some kind of enforced labor argument or, again, a violent conflict between the parties,
They could have made them watch Ad Astra repeatedly for decades, in which case Violent Uprising is completely justified.
If you wanted to throw a pseudo science fiction movie that's just terrible out there to be the thing that they were forced to watch, you could always just say Jupiter Ascending.
Ad Astra, the whole point of the movie is space sucks. Earth is where people are and life is to be lived. That's the sort of thing there. It's basically space is boring, the movie. No, really, it's boring. Don't go there.
I haven't seen Ad Astra yet.
Yeah.
Much as I do love Heart of Darkness as a novel, I don't need to see it in space.
The movie started and I waited for the action to pick up and then the credits started.
The chase across the lunar landscape is pretty cool.
That is the best part of the film. If you have seen that clip on YouTube, don't bother with the rest of the film. You have seen all the best that it has to offer.
I've got a funny thing about Ad Astra, actually, believe it or not. Have you seen the movie Space Cowboys?
Yes, I have.
You know Brad Pitt in Ad Astra is older than Tommy Lee Jones was when Tommy Lee Jones made Space Cowboys?
I did not know that.
We do not age equally.
And another movie with James Cromwell.
Also true.
Yeah. So another thing that annoys me about the Baku is just how perfectly clean and ideal their back to nature lifestyle is. For an agricultural society,
There's a severe lack of poop.
Exactly. Everything would be covered in poop. I haven't spent much time on farms in my life. I've been around farms a little bit. I've driven past farms, and it is not the cleanliness of lifestyle. And mad respect to all you farmers out there. Thank you for feeding us all.
I agree with you a little bit about the Baku. It's like
They're a bit
there's
insufferable.
just a touch. The best Baku is the kid who plays with Data.
Yeah, and the little CGI hippo.
Oh god, that thing looks so bad.
The CGI where it's non-organic stuff is fine, I think. The starships are fine, but yeah, they're
perfectly acceptable, especially for the 90s. The fact that that thing was an early Pixar creation.
It would have looked good in a CG movie, but compositing into an actual live-action film is like, yep, that's CG.
The lack of explanation of the backstory of the Sona kind of detracts from what they could have brought as menacing villains. Their aesthetic is really cool. The kind of like mummified look is pretty sweet.
The rank bars that kind of cover the whole shoulder, I thought that was kind of a neat little detail.
Well, the fact that all of their aesthetic is very obviously heavily Egyptian inspired because they look like mummies.
It's built around them kind of needing constant surgery to keep them alive and looking somewhat presentable by their standards.
We mentioned him a few times, but Admiral Dougherty, the actor there, when he auditioned for the part, didn't actually read his given lines initially. He quoted part of Dante's Inferno, then transitioned into reading his lines, and I think it was Jonathan Frakes and a couple other people like, yeah, sure, you've got it. They just offered it to him.
He played a good part. Again, not an actual evil character, just someone who's trying to do the right thing, but doesn't quite have the whole picture.
This movie plays a lot lighter and was probably necessary after First Contact, which, while it does have moments of levity, is a much heavier film. This has some genuinely funny stuff here. The fact that they distract the brain-damaged Data by singing British Tar from the HMS Pinafore.
With the little dot on the lines in the Alcars.
Oh, yeah, the sing-along dot, and then Picard looking at Worf at one point going, sing, Worf, sing, and Worf just kind of looked rapidly and horrifiedly shaking his head no.
Mr. Worf, do you know Gilbert and Sullivan? No, Captain, I have not had a chance to meet all the new crew members yet. Yeah, it was well done, and the actual action scene itself I thought was pretty good. Again, you can kind of tell that it was CG, but as 90s CG goes, it still passes,
could have been worse. I think. Another personal favorite there is another Brent Spiner moment. After Riker is shaved for the first time in a decade, Data looks at him funny and, smooth as an android's bottom, eh, Data? And then they go through another scene, and then as they're kind of breaking up, Data goes up to him, Commander, may I? And he feels his face, and he just looks at him, kind of smiles, and shakes his head.
I wouldn't at all be surprised if that was an improv. Yeah,
probably.
I would have to say that the TNG movies, overall, they get the comedy right. There's just enough in there. It feels natural enough that it deflates things sufficiently. We did have Data go a bit overboard, but then that actually became part of the story in Generations, where he just kind of goes crazy laughing because he just can't handle it anymore. But overall, I think they found a good balance between the heavier aspect and some levity in it.
Yeah, Insurrection is a perfectly adequate way to kill 90 minutes.
It's kind of hard to really have anything deep or meaningful to say about this film because, yeah, it's all right. It's fun space film. That's kind of it.
It's not great. It's not bad. It exists.
Yeah, it's a fun romp. It's worth a watch, but it doesn't get up on the podium of best Trek ever. On the bright side, it's certainly far away from worst.
Well, since you brought that up, that does give us the segue we need.
Okay, yeah. So now let's get into it. The moment you've all been waiting for, Nemesis.
So in Star Trek Nemesis, the Enterprise finds another Sung android identical to Data on a backwater planet near the Romulan neutral zone. They are then informed that there has been a coup on the Romulan homeworld, and they are ordered to meet with the new leader of the Romulan Empire, who represents a subcaste of aliens living in the Romulan Empire called the Remans. They meet the new leader named Shinzon and discover he is a clone of Captain Picard. Shinzon and Picard debate about how similar or different they are until it is revealed that Shinzon needs to harvest Picard for a medical procedure to save his life. He planted the android, B4, to lure the Enterprise close to the neutral zone to ensure they would be sent to him. B4 has also been programmed to assist in Shinzon's plan. Shinzon's ship, the Scimitar, has a superweapon capable of eradicating all life on a planet. He plans on using it to attack Earth and defeat the Federation. The Enterprise and some of the Romulan military fight with the Scimitar. Picard beams over to the Scimitar on a suicide mission to destroy the weapon. Data takes his place at the last minute, sacrificing himself. Shinzon is defeated at the cost of Data's life.
It baffles me how bad this movie is.
Yeah. Initially, I got caught up in a lot more of the hate for Nemesis. I'd say now I've softened on it a bit. It tried, it just failed spectacularly.
Here's my thing about this movie. There's a few ways you can tell this movie's bad. First of all, no one likes it. Even its defenders don't actually like it. They just think the critics are too harsh. It's written by John Logan, whose screenplay credits include Bats, Any Given Sunday, Gladiator, The Time Machine, Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas, sadly underappreciated DreamWorks movie, Last Samurai, The Aviator, Sweeney Todd, God help that movie, Rango, Coriolanus, Hugo, Skyfall, Spectre, Genius, and Alien Covenant. This man is not a stranger to writing quality material.
That's a decent filmography.
Point being, this is a man who knows how to write. That's a really good list of stuff he's done. Unfortunately, I think we just have to wind up pointing out the director here. The director is a gentleman by the name of Stuart Baird. Stuart Baird is a quite competent editor. In fact, he has edited some very, very exceptional film. If you don't mind listing his editing credits, we have, among others, Lethal Weapon, Lady Hawk, the first two Superman movies. In fact, he's the one who cut together the Donner Cut that was released in 2006. Casino Royale, Salt, Skyfall, The Legend of Zorro, Demolition Man. And if you look at any of those movies, those are well-edited films. The problem is, if we're talking about what he's done as a director, and he's done some second unit work, but if you look at him just as the director, there's a grand total of 3 movies. There's Executive Decision, U.S. Marshals, and Star Trek Nemesis. And I think there's a reason the man has not had a directorial feature in 18 years. And it's this movie. It just boggles the mind that the assemblage of talent you got with that writer, a very, very qualified editor, I still don't understand why they didn't offer this to Jonathan Frakes. I really, really don't. He was apparently in the process of making the Thunderbirds movie.
This would have been a much better thing for him to focus on if he could have.
100%. Might have been a bit of a crunch for him to do both, but Star Trek has a very particular feel to it. If I could step into the alternate universe where Jonathan Frakes directs this movie, I would. I would just like to see it. But this is a badly put together film.
As much as you're going off on the directing, I do think that the writing should get some of the blame.
Oh yeah. I'm not entirely sure how this movie could focus on the villain as much as it does, but also do nothing with that time.
Pretty much.
That's almost an art form in and of itself to pull that off, you know? Let's talk a little bit about some of the good before we just go into too much of what's just awful. Tom Hardy as young Picard is great. I mean, Tom Hardy is kind of generally great. He absolutely makes this work. This is one of his earlier films. Not the earliest, but one of his earlier ones.
This was before he was famous.
Yeah, much. He does a really good job. He plays off Patrick Stewart well. His costume is terrible. I need to say that. I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but it wasn't. But he does a really good job with his performance. Ron Perlman, God bless him.
He's in this movie, check.
He is, and he's menacing in makeup.
Yep, he sat in the chair. Good on you, sir. Cash that check.
Ron Perlman is kind of awesome.
Yeah, he's just kind of awesome in anything. He just brings it to the table no matter what.
And given some of the stuff he's been in, that actually does say a lot about him. There's plenty of times he could have phoned it in and no one would have blamed him. The opening wedding sequence between Riker and Troy is actually really nice.
The best critique of that I've heard is, why wasn't Loxana there?
That's a fair question.
Like her mother. This woman who has made her life a living hell every episode she has been in because she is not getting married doesn't show up to her wedding.
That becomes a running gag. Like they had this ceremony on Earth and they were going to Beta Z to do a different ceremony there, which is where Troy's parents would be.
I think functionally it makes sense. One, you don't really want to add Loxana Troy to a film and then have to have her be there for the rest of the movie. Like, did you just go back to her quarters while all this was happening?
Yeah, that's definitely a problem that
Yeah.
they were able to avoid, thankfully. But yeah, there's actually a bit of a running gag that comes up about the Beta Z marriage ceremony. Apparently all people that attending are naked. So Worf is like, no, sir, I do not think it's appropriate for a Starfleet officer to be out of uniform. I love, is it Picard or is it somebody else who looks over at him and goes, for a big strapping Klingon, what are you afraid of?
That sounds more like a Riker line. I remember Picard's
it's
line.
Riker or I think it's like Riker or Crusher. It's one of those two.
I remember Picard's line was, well, if you'll excuse me, I'll be in the gym.
Yeah, that was a good one. Because he says, yeah, we will all follow the appropriate Beta Z tradition. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be in the gym.
Nice little line. Feels natural.
Needs to be said again is all Patrick Stewart can almost do no wrong as this character at this point.
Almost.
Picard. We'll get to
Almost.
Picard. That's its own show.
Even in this movie, I remember a certain off-roading scene.
Okay, yeah, there is that. Look, I don't know why John Logan or Stuart Baird thought it was important to have a Mad Max moment in the middle of your Star Trek movie.
Because they could pay Patrick Stewart less.
If him off-roading with that thing made him happier, then you know what? God bless him.
Apparently, he's a car guy. He likes off-road rallying. If you want Patrick Stewart to be in your movie to play Picard, he needs to agree to the terms. And it's, well, will you take $1 million less if we put in a scene where you get to go off-roading and get paid for it?
If you're Patrick Stewart at this point and you're just having fun, I'm not going to hold that against him or anyone else. Yeah. I'll hold it against the writing and the directing for not making that scene better and fit in the movie.
The whole ignoring of ground vehicles throughout all of Star Trek is something that needs to be addressed at some point.
Boy, isn't it?
But also, you have a shuttle. You already have a vehicle that you use to carry the vehicle, and that initial vehicle is just better at everything. It can fly from point to point. It can hover. It's got transporters in it.
Yeah, less likely to cause problems with the locals.
And again, this is a pre-warp civilization, so the least obvious way of doing things is probably the best. Maybe wait till nighttime when it's hard to see things, then send your little shuttle down, beam down to the locations from the shuttle where the parts are, and then grab them and then fly back up.
That scene is also badly shot. I don't know how intentional it was to have everything have the gamma filter turned up too high, but I almost can't watch anything that happens on that planet because it looks too bright.
It's an alien planet, so it has
so
to
therefore
look
everything must lens flare.
You got to save some money in the budget somehow.
Considering this thing only had a budget of $60 million.
They made pretty good use of it.
Jeez, this thing only made $67 million.
Yeah. So, speaking in terms of production design and special effects.
In terms of what it looks like relative to its budget, yes, they absolutely maximized it. That's very fair. The final space battle is nice. It needs to be said, that's one of the better space battles we've had in Star Trek in some time.
If you like space battles, that's a good space battle.
Part of the problem comes from, hey, let's run the ships into each other. I'm sorry. That's just stupid.
It does kind of tie into the strange thing in the movies where they start trying to make Picard more of an action hero, and that just doesn't really gel with the character. He's always been more of the diplomat. He's more likely to talk himself out of a situation than shoot his way out. He can fight, but that's not really him.
At one point in this movie, in and of itself, when Shinzon says, so if Picard's always been warriors, his response is, I tend to think of myself as an explorer.
Exactly.
This is not John McClane, right?
Yeah, another thing Picard gets wrong.
Truth.
You even have that bit at the beginning of the movie where they're doing the diplomatic function and they're about to go into the room and Picard just sighs and goes, remember when we used to be explorers?
Yeah, to the beginning of Insurrection. It's a really great moment, too. And here, trying to turn him into an action hero was just a horrible mistake. From a characterization perspective, from all of it, I try very, very hard not to do when it comes to Star Trek that this doesn't work this way. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to pull that card when it comes to the two giant spaceships crashing into each other. One of them moving at full speed in space, traveling at full impulse power, especially when there's a sequence, I think it's earlier in this same movie, where a ship gets blown up and the other part of it flies off and hits another one and severely damages it.
Yep, that was a lucky shot. They framed it like that was intentional, but come on, man.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If you're not even going to be internally consistent about these things, I'm going to have to call you on it. Speaking of ship design, needs to be said, the Scimitar is a cool ship.
Yeah, it looks nice and spiky and nasty. I think as Picard puts it, she's a predator.
And when they read off, it's like armaments. It's got so many torpedo arrays. And it's an intimidating ship visually, and its established mechanics for those who like to get into that stuff. It's a badass ship. It really is.
My only real issues with the Scimitar is there's a lot of wasted space in it. The bridge is huge, and he's got that reception room that he reveals himself to the crew, and it just seems like, come on, guys, you can make it a bit smaller. And then just the idea that this slave race living under constant guard and oppression of the Romulans was somehow able to build the most technologically sophisticated ship in the quadrant with a perfect cloaking device and this metagenic weapon or whatever the heck it was. That seems a bit far-fetched, but okay, it's got to work for the story.
I've got a bigger gripe with them talking on and on about how badass the Remans are, and then dual-wielding Picard is able to cut through 24 of them on his way to escaping.
My understanding was this was supposed to focus more on the Romulans, because the Romulans have never really been fully fleshed out, often being a bit more of a elusive, mysterious enemy. And that does not mean that Romulans have two names, one only for their lovers. Oh, jeez, that's so stupid. Stop trying to write cultures. You're bad at this. Basically, they're space Romans. And I did actually really like some of the updated designs of the Romulans. They finally got rid of those silly, baggy shoulders on their uniforms, which I thought was a great step in the right direction. The new warbirds that they're using, the Valdor-class warbirds that they fly in the end battle, I think is a really slick, cool-looking design and a great evolution of the existing Romulan aesthetic. We were supposed to set up this movie to deal with the Romulans, and it's all about the Remans.
I don't know how this movie is so devoid of emotion. How is it that you could kill Data and somehow render that to be an emotionally non-factor for the audience?
Like, let's compare this to the death of Spock in Wrath of Khan. This might just be Brett Spiner doesn't want to play Data anymore.
Well, he apparently had kind of requested that his character die in Insurrection. In fact, when he was given his copy of the script, there was a post-it note attached to it that said, "Sorry, kill you next time."
Credit where credit's due, they made good on that. When you had Spock dying in Wrath of Khan, that was related to the whole Kobayashi Maru setup. This is the no-win scenario, and that's Spock's solution to it, and it is that Kirk didn't save everyone in the end. He beat Khan, but he lost his best friend in the process. Whereas it's just Data decides to sacrifice himself for the ship, which is a good action, but thematically there's nothing else there. He just does it.
Yeah, you really did need to set up more about his relationship with Picard in particular, because that's what he's doing. He's not saving the ship, he's saving Picard. Because Picard was there and had enough time to go get a phaser and blow up the the MacGuffin.
Yeah.
He had enough time to stop it. Data makes a very conscious decision that the life of my friend is worth more than my life at this moment, which is fine. Like, I'm not opposed to that. It just, there needs to be something that needs to be set up.
Well, Data and Picard, and Red Letter Media has really harped on this, they never really had that deep of a relationship. They had a relationship, and we can assume that might have gotten stronger in the time between the season finale of Next Generation and this point in the continuity. But Data's always been more of a friend to like Geordi or Barclay or even Wesley, and he's never really been close to Picard. He respects him, but we've never really had it established that these are two people who are good friends.
Yeah.
Even in First Contact, where Picard says, I need to stay and get Data, it's because Data was one of the people who helped him when he was Locutus. It wasn't I owe Data in particular as a special thing. It's just he's on my crew. He never gave up on me, and I owe him the same duty.
Which is fine, and that's not a complaint about that beat in First Contact. It's just if you want to establish that, you've got to establish that. It can't be thrown out there like this is.
You needed something in Data's character at the beginning of the movie in relation to that. Maybe it's him contemplating his mortality or lack thereof and the value of one life versus another, or something like that. And then in the end, he decides it's worth his life to save Picard.
It wouldn't even have been that difficult to do, and sadly, it just is completely non-existent as far as this movie goes.
Sad in the sense that I like Data. I don't want Data to die. Data dies. This sucks. Within the movie itself,
it doesn't hit any kind of emotional note as far as that goes.
It's better than Tasha Yar.
Funny.
I would say the biggest weakness of the film is probably the villain.
Which is so weird, because Tom Hardy's performance is really good.
Oh, I agree.
He's not given anything.
The idea is it's supposed to be like Shinzon is a mirror for Picard. Picard had a much better, easier life. Shinzon grew up in a slave camp, so it's nature versus nurture.
If you lived my life, you'd be right where I am. It's not a bad point to ponder in a philosophical way, but if you keep harping on it and then only come to the very obvious conclusion that no, having the same genetic structure doesn't make us the same person, congratulations. Every pair of identical twins ever knows this by the age of about 5.
Neat idea, and it's also like, how would Shinzon also just happen to be a tactical genius? It could happen with his life experience. Like, the idea that that's just some sort of inherent quality he has. Usually learning how to do like starship combat or even just modern naval combat, you usually kind of have to go to school for that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's very rare to kind of have like a savant, I've never captained a ship before, but oh, look, I'm just so brilliant at it. For me, it's more, he has this disease.
His medical condition was that not only was he a clone, but the plan that the Romulans had was to have a clone and then at some point replace the real Picard with the cloned Picard. And then they would have a Romulan asset in an incredibly important point in the Federation. This plan was abandoned when a new government came to power, and the young Shinzon was stuck in the mines with the other Remans. His medical condition stems from something about how they cloned him because they needed his aging to accelerate. Otherwise, you're going to have just a 50-year younger version of Picard, and he can't suddenly show up and be Picard. When they didn't activate that part of his genetic sequence to increase his aging, his DNA started breaking down. And the only way to fix this would be to replace not just his blood. I kind of got the impression it was a lot more than that.
So Shinzon needs Picard, some sort of transfer of his biological
essence
or body or something to stop his clone deteriorating thing. And then this is like really time sensitive. He's going to die in, I think, 3 days from when his coup starts.
From when Picard shows up to his expiration is very rapid.
He decides to spend the first 48 hours just sitting off the bow of the Enterprise in his ship fully cloaked, looking at the Enterprise. This is a strategic genius, apparently.
Yeah, there's some real weakness there as far as the proper writing of that.
I can understand him not just asking Picard for his help, because again, due to his upbringing and his life experience, not a very trusting person. Picard could say no, and now he's showed his hand, and Picard can take precautions to protect himself. So why take the risk? Let's just kidnap Picard and do it anyway. I'm not sure why they needed before and all of that, and it seems to be an overly convoluted plan that he executes incredibly stupidly.
That is very accurate.
Like, I'm okay for, all right, here's our motivation as to why Shinzon is attacking Picard. I'm not sure why he then has to go to Earth to destroy the Federation. That just seems to be just because.
Yeah, they don't really establish that as far as his motivation there.
You could do something where like he wants the approval of the Romulans for some reason. It's like, hey, look, I will destroy the Federation, your great enemy, and you will all love me, and now you will see how wrong you were to throw me away, or something like that. I'm just shooting from the hip here, but yeah, again, it's just mustache twirling villain stuff for its own sake.
The other enormous downfall of this movie is the lack of understanding about how the ensemble nature of the cast has to function. Nobody apart from Data and Picard do anything.
Troy gets raped, and Riker has a fight in a bottomless pit on the lowest deck of the Enterprise. Seriously, why did they put a bottomless pit on the lowest deck of the Enterprise?
Because it's in the television show.
The writers of this episode should be fired.
Whoever wrote this episode should die. For the record, I stand by this. Galaxy Quest is the best Star Trek movie.
It is a good movie.
Will Wheaton thinks it's the best Star Trek movie.
I know Jonathan Frakes loves it. Patrick Stewart loves it. Jonathan Frakes actually recommended it to him.
Yeah, Patrick Stewart wasn't going to watch it until Frakes recommended it. Decay loves it. In fact, when it came out, someone asked him about it. He said he thought it was a chilling documentary about life on the Star Trek set. The bottomless pit on the bottom deck of the Enterprise was a terrible idea.
Yeah, I mean, it looks cool in an action scene, but it's just like, wait a minute, they're on the bottom of the Enterprise? There shouldn't be a pit there. This would be something like if they had to eject the warp core and they were fighting on top of where the warp core should be. Then, yes, you could have a pit of that size.
Maybe you could get away with it if their artificial gravity goes or, they have to pull the ship vertical. So they're on the walkway, and then as the ship goes straight up, to the extent that there's up in space, which is a minor gripe I have with. I don't hold the lack of realistic space combat against Star Trek because nobody gets it right.
The Expanse, I think, is the closest I've seen.
Where I am in the Expanse, there hasn't been a tremendous amount of it yet. And full kudos to everyone involved in that show for your dedication to being as close to scientifically accurate as feasible for a television show.
There are allowances made for story, but it certainly is, of all the mainstream sci-fi I've seen, the one that gets it the closest.
By a significant margin. Point being, if they'd had the Enterprise go, vertical, and they're hanging on a catwalk, so now they've got however far down this particular tube goes the length of the deck that they're on, I might have bought that, but they don't even go that far. It's like, hey, random pit.
Say what you will about the J.J. Abrams movies, they did actually do that, and that was a pretty brilliant move.
I don't have a whole lot else about Nemesis. It's kind of a mess. There is nothing uniquely Star Trek about this other than the characters.
We haven't really talked about B4 at all, and that's just kind of B4. He's there. That's kind of it. Doesn't really do that much.
He's more relevant to Picard.
He's more relevant as the potential resurrection of Data. And I do find it strange that they let him wander the ship at the start. Hey, remember the last time we found another version of Data? Yeah, that turned out really good.
Oh, forgetting what happens in your canonical IP is...
Jordy, remember when my brother Lore used my emotions chip to turn me evil and I was like putting needles into your brain so we could liquefy it? Yeah. Good times. It was right after I told Counselor Troy that I was having violent thoughts and she told me to experiment with it. Best counselor in Starfleet.
Oh, God.
The bartender is better at your job than you are.
I don't know. Guinan's way too hit and miss for me.
I think she gave better personal advice than Troy did to most people.
In some instances, yes. Nemesis it's a movie so bad. Not only did it cost the studio a lot of money, to the tune of something like $30 million, give or take, as a loss on just the production, not counting the advertising budget. It so ruined the entire IP of Star Trek that the next time they made movies, they said, hey, let's do an alternate reality of Kirk. That's how much damage this thing did to this IP.
It was the beginning of the long, dark void of nothingness. And in some ways, I'm not sure I don't miss it.
Would I take no Star Trek over Abrams' Star Trek? Yes.
Would I take no Star Trek over Kurtzman's Star Trek? Pretty much, yeah. Nemesis, I find that it has some good qualities. The space battles I thought were really good. The performances are decent. I kind of like what little more we do get to see of the Romulans and how they've evolved their design a bit. It kind of pushes things a bit there. But yeah, overall, I'd say I think they were trying to swing for the fences with this one, but it was a swing and a miss. They wanted to have some sort of deep conflict with Picard, looking inside himself. Brett Spiner wanted off the show, and they're trying to come up with like a big finish for the TNG crew, I think, and it just kind of ended up as more of a whimper. So I can respect it for trying, even though it failed, but in the end, it failed.
It failed pretty badly. I mean, Bryan Singer has a brief on-camera role, and the less said about that jackass, the better. Jonathan Frakes has been critical of this.
Marina Sirtis.
She had some really harsh things to say about the director. I think she called him a moron.
You know it's bad when the stars and the cast and crew feel that they can freely denounce it.
Even Patrick Stewart, when he was promoting Picard, said that he thought Nemesis was a very weak finale for this group of characters.
And we're still waiting for a strong finale. I don't think we're ever going to get it.
Nemesis is just somewhat ill-conceived, very poorly executed. I kind of wish it didn't exist.
I think with all the other films we've watched tonight, we could at least say, yeah, go ahead, give them a watch. Generations has its flaws, but it's still pretty good. First Contact is one of the best. Go watch it now. Insurrection, it's middle of the road, but again, it's a nice little two-parter done as a movie with more money, whereas Nemesis is like, I mean, for completionist's sake, there's some neat stuff in it, but overall, it's just kind of a by the end.
Yeah, it's a giant letdown.
I think we're pretty much at the end here, so any final thoughts?
I think I said this when we talked about the other series of films. Anytime you get to this number of films, you're going to find duds. The law of averages says you're going to hit something that's really, really bad. If this were only 3 movies long, I think it would be a really good trilogy. Again, Generations has some highs and lows. First Contact is amazing. Insurrection, a good 2-parter for the series. That's a solid enough trilogy. You go for 4. Even if you take really long-running franchises that have multiple iterations of creative people involved, like if you take James Bond, even if you break up James Bond into the different Bond eras, Connery had some that were good and 1 or 2 that were really bad. Pierce Brosnan had a couple that were good and a few that were just, and 1 in particular that just should not be talked about. Daniel Craig has been batting a little over 500, but you're never going to get, with this many movies, a universally high level of consistency. You're going to have dips. And unfortunately for the TNG crew, their movie run ended on one of the lowest Star Trek movies ever made.
And it's been painful for, I think, all the fandom to just have to wait so long to find out anything happening after that point. It's just been prequels and reimaginings and alternate universes.
Think about how bad this had to be to do that kind of damage to this resilient an IP. It almost boggles the mind that something could be that bad.
It took decades before they addressed anything beyond that in the timeline, with the exception of Star Trek Online. You think that sums it all up?
Yeah, I do not regret rewatching 3 of these, and I don't even feel terrible about rewatching the last one. I just kind of had to do it to get through it.
It's more of a historical artifact to be studied than a movie to be enjoyed.
That is true.
Any plugs before we go?
It's my usual stuff. You can find me talking movies and television on occasion here on the Rattleton Broadcasting Network under the W2M Network subheading. I host the 411 Ground and Pound MMA podcast for fans of mixed martial arts. That is recorded Sunday evenings. It goes live right around then most times. And I cover mixed martial arts and professional wrestling over at 411 Mania, SmackDown on Fridays in the Wrestling Zone, and then UFC events pretty much every Saturday in the MMA Zone. So if you're interested, please do stop by. I appreciate all the support I can get over there because it takes a fair amount of my time and energy, and I try to do my best at it. So hopefully it's enjoyable to some segment of the population.
And of course, we'll be back again for more of Star Trek Retrospective. Probably up next will be the Kelvin timeline movies. Robert, I believe you'll be joining us for that.
Yeah, I will stoke some of my ire.
So thank you very much for coming and hosting with me, Robert. And on behalf of both of us, live long and prosper, everyone.